Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending my presentation. For the next hour, we're going to be looking at ways that we can achieve scalable threat detection and response, so performing effective detection and response in large environments and environments where sophisticated threat actors are active. We're going to start by looking at some of the ways that traditional approaches to this fails. So these will probably be similar to what you currently do, or hopefully what you did in the past, and you're moving to some more of these scalable ways. But we want to see how IR and detection was traditionally done, and then we want to be able to see how can we change that to meet the needs of modern networks and investigations. We'll then look at some of the questions that are needed for effective detection and response. So if you're on an incident handling team, or if you're bringing in a team like a third party to do IR for you, these are questions they need answered. So if you can't answer those currently, if you can't answer them fully, then don't expect to receive effective response. And so we're going to want to change our networks and augment them to be able to actually answer those questions and get the data. And then we'll obviously spend a lot of time talking about how do we actually implement that and what does it look like. For those that haven't met before, my name is Andrew Case. So I spent a good bit of time on open source tool development, on volatility and registry decoder, one of the co-authors of The Art of Memory Forensics. In the past, I don't do them as much anymore, but for several years, I worked on insider threat investigations, so dealing with companies that were being ripped off by an employee or a contractor or something along those lines. We had to figure out what did they actually do, what did they take, how did they do it. Those investigations really didn't have to scale. One or two people stealing some data isn't going to require analysis of hundreds of machines. But then with what I do now, when we're doing IR, these require lots of scale and lots of analysis. And so what we want to do is figure out when we're on large networks, when we have hundreds of machines, thousands of machines, how can we effectively deal with that many machines? How do we scale our operations? And then we'll also see it gets very challenging when you're dealing with what I would call skilled attackers, because they don't want you to find them. They're going to work in ways that traditional forensics simply won't find them, so you have to innovate what you're doing. And if we look at these ways of traditional detection and response, they really don't work, and they fall flat on several fronts. The first one is that if you look at IR from several years ago, you were only looking at a handful of systems. The attackers got on one system, they then pivoted to the system that had all the critical data on it, and then they took it. And so when you were doing your incident response and when you were trying to figure out where should I focus my detection for where the attackers will most likely go, it wasn't that difficult. Versus with modern networks, it's obviously much different. The other thing, and we'll see quite a few examples of this, is the way in the past attackers really didn't do a whole lot of anti-forensics. Or if they did, it was kind of a red flag that, hey, an attacker was here, so you could figure out not only did they do anti-forensics, you could go back and find what they were trying to hide. So it was not particularly effective. And so doing traditional response and working on traditional detection was fairly straightforward. It really wasn't that difficult. But if we look at the cases that many of us work on now, you have the possibility when you walk into an environment and look at what the attackers were doing, there's tens of systems, hundreds of systems, thousands of systems that might be in scope. These systems are not all in one place. They're going to be spread across networks, spread across the world, and we're not just dealing with one type of device anymore. It's not a Windows desktop somewhere with a Linux server. We see all the operating systems spread out, and we see them all across different types of hardware devices as well. And so we'll talk a lot about how can we narrow down what our scope is, how can we narrow down what to focus on, but to do that, we need a lot put in place before the actual incident happens and before we really want to start good detection. And then the other thing, as I mentioned, is a big pain point, is the way modern attackers work, they're not just looking for one system. If you look at the tool sets they use, they have scale as a feature. So if they want to rapidly compromise hundreds or thousands of systems, the tools have the ability to do that. And then the tools are very anti-forensics minded as well. So if you perform traditional forensics, you're not going to find them. And if we look at this anti-forensics in a little bit of depth, what you'll see is that the attackers the first thing they're doing is operating in memory. If you look at how antivirus and your security endpoint agents work, they're looking essentially for activity on disk. They're going to look for files on disk, and the AV will scan them. A file will get downloaded, and before the AV lets you use it, it will scan it. Same thing, security agents work very similarly. They're looking for malware on disk. They want to perform their analysis on it. They are going to monitor some of the APIs. They'll go a little bit beyond what AV does. But when malware is in memory, all of that still gets bypassed. And so when you have attackers working in memory, you don't have anything on disk. I'm not talking about fileless malware, where the malware writes to, say, the registry or some other file and then loads it a tricky way. This is malware that literally never touches the disk. If you reboot the machine that's infected, the malware goes away and doesn't come back. Did anyone read the Kaspersky report from last year when their network got completely compromised? So I would recommend reading that. If you're at this conference, you would definitely enjoy that report. Kaspersky's full network was compromised. The attackers took everything Kaspersky cared about: source codes, signatures, all the above. And if you read the attack report, it's very detailed, and it says the reason the attackers were here, the reason we didn't detect them, is because the malware that loaded on our critical servers was memory only. So there was a system somewhere that no one cared about. That system had registry persistence on it, so that system had malware on the disk, but then that system would attack all the other machines across the network. And so I guarantee every network has at least one machine, everyone that has been forgotten about, but your critical systems that you're actually going to look at and you're going to investigate, there was nothing on disk. That malware would attack them over the network. It would use stolen credentials. It would load the malware directly into memory. And so that was Kaspersky's excuse or reason why the attackers were so successful against them. Versus if any type of memory forensics would have been done on those systems, they would have found it right away. And in almost every investigation that we do now, the attackers are only in memory. There's very little, if anything, left on disk. And then if you do have malware that writes to disk or that your traditional live IR tools will look for, so you're going to run a live IR tool, look for processes and network connections and get a file listing and look for logged in users. The way those tools work are they're dependent on the system APIs. So I'm not going to name tools and shame them, but this is true of any live IR tool that's out there. Whether you download it from the internet, whether you write it yourself, whether it runs in userland, whether it runs in the kernel, all of those are relying on APIs that the operating system provides. And the first thing that malware does when it loads is hooks those APIs. So you ask for the list of processes, and you see all the processes that are running except for the malware. You ask for the list of network connections, and you see all the network connections that are active except for the malware. And then I can name the 30 other things that malware is going to hook as well. And so when you read these reports where companies are compromised for years before detection and the malware was there, and they say, well, why couldn't you see the malware? It's because it's literally impossible to see it on the live system. Really, the only thing you can do at that point is memory forensics. And if you ask industry-wide how many people go around doing memory forensics on machines, some people do it. Some people have teams that do it. Some people bring in third parties to do it. But it's not a commonly done thing. Everyone gets pen tests. Not everyone's going to proactively do memory analysis on their critical systems. And then the other issue here, when we try to apply that traditional forensics, is the notion of scale. Defenders' tools do not scale very well. There's not a lot of tools to really deep dive a large number of systems to a great degree, but the attackers do have this ability. I have a short list here. I could have filled many slides with it. If you look at PowerShell, if you look at the ability to remotely push out group policy, remotely schedule tasks on Windows, the attacker toolsets take advantage of all of this. They have compromised domain admin credentials. At that point, they can run PowerShell scripts on every resource on the network. Mandiant had an interesting report recently where a threat group they compromised the domain controller, and then they were pushing out group policy that installed ransomware. So literally every machine in the network will be infected overnight with ransomware once that happens. That's attackers being able to compromise your entire network in minutes. There's no equivalent of that on the defender side. There's nothing commercial, open source, anything that you can run that says these 10,000 machines that I can contact are completely secure and there's no malware on them. So we're definitely at a disadvantage when we're working with this. How many people have heard of or seen PowerShell Empire? Only a handful of people. So this is one of the tools that should scare you. This is probably the best open source free tool that exemplifies a lot of this. So as I said, PowerShell is open source. You can go download it from GitHub. On the website, there's a number of presentations from the author. But if you read some of this, it should not make you feel good from a defender standpoint. This slide jumped. Everything that PowerShell Empire is going to do on the network is encrypted. It works as all PowerShell agents, but it doesn't actually run PowerShell.exe. It's re-implemented a lot of what we see in malware, so it has key logging capabilities, it has screenshot capabilities. It also has a port of Mimikatz. If you're not familiar with Mimikatz, it allows for extraction of all of the clear text passwords as well as hash passwords on your machine. We had a client recently where Mimikatz was run on the domain controller, so at that point you might as well just rebuild the network because the attackers have everything. And so PowerShell Empire is a really good example of this. And so if you think your endpoints are secure now, or if you want to see how would my endpoint stand up to a real attack that's only going to be operated through memory, this is a great way to do it. It's an open source tool. Get a test system that matches what's in your environment, and see if your endpoint agent, see if your AV, see if your network sensors actually pick up on any of this, because this is what attackers are using. They're not obviously using PowerShell Empire directly, but they've re-implemented the same things in their own tool sets. And this is not something completely new. Interpreter inside of Metasploit has had this since around 2006, maybe 2007, being able to perform attacks only in memory. With Interpreter, it will read DLLs and code that it's going to use over the network that will be loaded directly into memory. And so that's another situation where if you walk up to the machine and you pull the plug, you turn that machine off and you don't have a memory sample, then all that evidence went away. And we see a lot of issues on the network as well. One thing we see a lot is the network sensors that people have installed. They're really just looking for known malicious websites or domains. That gets a little bit into threat intel, which is a whole different talk. But it's very difficult if all you can detect on the network are things that are known bad. Because if you're the first company that's attacked, if it's a targeted attack, then obviously there's not going to be anything in the database there. And then we still see companies still trying to do full network capture. So they'll give us a huge hard drive of PCAPs and say what's there. That's a lot to process. Most of it's going to be encrypted. Many websites are SSL by default. So we'll see that there's smarter ways to capture network data and manage it. And so what I want to do is look at some of the questions that we commonly ask our clients during incident response. It's not just us, but every other IR organization as well. If you're on an internal team, these are questions that you should be asking during response. And there's two reasons for this. These questions, they have two purposes. One is we want to be able to scale down an investigation. If we know that one machine is compromised or we get one sort of indicator of badness that we want to check for, we don't want to have to look at every machine in our environment. We want to have logging in place. We want to have historical data so that we can say out of the 10,000 machines in our environment, there's 10 of them that probably talk to this bad domain. And so then we can deep dive those 10 systems. That's a reasonable approach to take versus we're going to do manual forensics on 10,000 machines, which just doesn't work. No one can do that. So as I'm going through these questions, be thinking about, I'm not going to make anyone raise hands, obviously, but can you answer these questions in your own environment? If you can, for how long? So this first one, if I tell you maliciouswebsite.com is hosting malware, and we want to know, did anyone in your environment visit that website? If you can tell me that, well, how long can you tell me that for? Can you say only for the last hour? Can you tell me up to a year ago? What level can you tell me currently, and what level are you comfortable with? If you think it's longer, or right now you only have, say, web logs for a week, that's probably not good enough. Most people don't detect every breach that they have within a week. A couple months would be better. Some companies are really paranoid and keep it longer, but then you get into legal issues because then it's all open to discovery. So there's a lot to think about, but these are questions that you definitely want to be able to answer. The other thing to think about is what coverage do you have? So if I ask you which of your employees visited a malicious website, how full of an answer can you give me? Is it just people at the main office? Can you tell me about all your offices around the world? What if someone was using their phone? Obviously connected to the company network. What about traveling people? If you have sales teams, if you have marketing teams, are they forced to go back through the VPN? How complete of an answer can you give me just based on knowing this website and just based on your web logs?
So I had a question regarding analysis of memory when they don't touch disk. So normally I would use like ncase, guidance is ncase or something like that to actually analyze that memory. Is there any open source stuff?
Yeah, we're going to actually go through all the tools and stuff, all open source tools. So, yeah, so again, you want to be able to answer how long could you go back and answer these questions for, and how complete would your answers be. And it becomes an issue if you say, for instance, I can tell you about all my people that have a desktop and come to the office every day, but I can't give you an instant answer for my salespeople. Well, what does that mean? Do we have to bring all their laptops in? Do we have to bring all their devices in and analyze them? If this is really malicious malware, if it's targeted to your company, you probably do, because you can't just hope that, oh, well, the guy in accounting was targeted and we figured that out, and let's just assume that no one that travels was targeted by it. It doesn't work in the real world. So the fuller your coverage is, the quicker it's going to be, and the more we can scale our analysis. So again, one question is, what website was visited by malicious users? On the DNS side, what about just domain resolution? So if I tell you, or if I ask you how many people in your organization resolved baddomain.org, can you tell me that? Same thing, how long does that go back? What's your coverage like? Can you tell me which users downloaded certain files? We see this all the time where, particularly like with malicious advertising networks, it doesn't even have to be a targeted attack, but we know if a certain user was redirected to a Flash file of some type or a JavaScript file of some type, everyone in the organization is going to be on the same browser version. If one person got exploited, it's very likely the next person got exploited. So now instead of having to check, say, the browser history of every user on the network, we just go to the weblog, say which employees downloaded this file, and that's where we pivot our analysis to. Same thing when we're looking at lateral movement. Essentially, do you have net flow? Can you tell me which systems did an internal system connect to? When attackers got on a system initially, where did they pivot around the network? If you can't answer that, it becomes very hard, because then your scope is, well, the attackers could have moved anywhere. And unfortunately, we deal with those situations a lot. Another one, which is unfortunately, people don't always include this in their response plans, but let's say Bob's account was compromised, he clicked on a phishing link, his machine's infected. Where else did that account go around the network? Did he log into any internal web applications? Did he talk to any vendor portals? It's not just about direct logins to Windows servers around the network, it's every resource that those attackers now have access to that they didn't before. And then if we look on the disk, there's a lot we want to answer as well. If I tell you that malware.exe has a static way that we can detect it, it's going to make a certain registry key in the registry where it stores its data. Well, how quickly can you scan that across your network? If you have 10,000 machines and I give you the registry key, is it going to take you 10 minutes, an hour? Is it going to be something manual? Are you going to start putting together PowerShell scripts on the fly? How quick can you take those indicators and actually sweep your network with them? Because it's not going to be scalable unless your answer is certainly under a day. Something like an hour or two would be much nicer. And then when we get into malware that has the anti-forensics capabilities, that's when it starts to get difficult as well, because it becomes very, very tool specific. So if we look at this last one, which is something we commonly see, there's a keylogger on the machine. It writes to a hard-coded file path of c operations.log, and this file is hidden from the live system. So you can't just browse to it with, say, Explorer. You can't use PowerShell to try to read the file system and find the file. If the file is not there, obviously it won't be found. But if it is there, the malware is going to be hiding it. It does not exist on the live machine. So at this point, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, how is that malware hiding? If it's hooking an API in user land, then maybe I could use the sleuth kit to look for it. There's plenty of tools that use the sleuth kit in the background. The sleuth kit parses NTFS on disk. It doesn't call the APIs for it. So that might be one way to find the file. But what if our malware is operating in the kernel? Let's say it hooks the NTFS driver. Then anything running in the kernel or user land is not going to see the file either, because the sleuth kit's going to parse that NTFS on disk, but the NTFS data that's being presented is controlled by the malware's kernel driver. And then at that point, there's no way to find it on the live system, and as you might guess, we have to do memory forensics to go back and figure out it's there. Or we have to get a disk image and look that way, but that's slow, and we're trying to scale here. We certainly don't want to pull disk images. So again, if you can't answer all these questions, or if you don't know what the answers are to these questions, and you have an incident, or you just want to be able to perform what I would call effective detection, if you can't answer all of these, you definitely have some gaps. And this is 2 slides of 100 that I could make if I really wanted to expand this all the way out. So when we talk about effective detection and response, there's a few requirements that we need. One is what I'll call visibility, being able to monitor actions that we care about across the entire environment. Again, if you tell me we have great visibility in the data centers, but we have no idea what those people in sales do, well, there's a gap there, right? And there's companies that do that, whether it's for budgeting reasons, whether it's just they haven't got around to it yet, whether they didn't think it was important. The attackers know what's there. When they're inside your network, it's not that hard for them to figure out this network is monitored, this one isn't, or there's security here, there's security not here, and you can probably guess where they're going to pivot to. So wherever that gap is, that's the first place the attackers are going to go. It also makes it very hard when you're in a large environment and you want to be able to say, we're sure that we've contained this breach, we're sure that the malware's gone, we're sure that the attackers are out. If you don't have visibility everywhere, you really can't answer that question. You can say they're out of this one data center or they're out of this one office, but without full visibility, it's hard to do that. You're definitely not giving a complete answer. Another big thing here is historical data, so we'll see how we can log data that happened weeks or months ago. When you're doing IR, if data is not there, you can't magically make it reappear. If it wasn't logged, if that action isn't stored somewhere, even the best investigators can't help you in that situation. So we want to make sure that all of that data is being logged. And then the other thing is going through our acquisition and analysis processes so that we don't get fooled by anti-forensics. If your whole idea of going to a machine to see if there's malware is run your live IR tool and then look at all the output it gets, that's not going to work. This doesn't work anymore. There's also issues on the network where you can miss the malware as well, so we want to make sure that we have full coverage. So the first thing we need to do on the endpoints is actually log events that we care about. At a minimum, we need logins and logoffs. It's very hard to track where attackers moved if you can't figure out who logged into machines and when, versus again, if we say that Bob clicked the phishing link and the attackers got on his machine once the malware was loaded, and then we have login and logoff records, all we have to do is consult those records to say from when the malware was installed till we remove that malware, where all did Bob log into? And if we see anything suspicious, if it's a domain controller, the Exchange server, anywhere besides where Bob should be accessing, we know that was the attackers. And also if you have an employee, assuming they're not in on it, most of the time they're cooperative. And they can say, I logged into this server, logged into this server, I have no idea why my account was used on these other resources, and that's where you pivot your analysis. Because again, we want to scale. We don't want to go on just a fishing expedition or a hunting expedition trying to find every machine in the environment, seeing if it's compromised. We want to follow the attackers exactly where they went. Same thing with the user account and group creation. This is where attackers will leave backdoor accounts on the system. It kind of makes sense, right? Because eventually the attackers will get caught. We'll figure out that Bob was a user who had his credentials compromised, and then we'll make Bob change his password. Or in some cases, we'll delete his entire account. And you think at that point, well, maybe the attackers are gone. But unfortunately, they have all these backdoor accounts around the network. These will often be put in the local admin group if we're talking like Windows machines. And then the attackers are back to having full access to your network. And so if you don't have this type of auditing, again, you're not really doing full analysis or full forensics. I have in the desirable column because they're a little more intensive. They can take more space. It also takes a little bit to get to configure these correctly, but being able to see process creation and termination. So on Windows, you can tell the event logs to have process auditing. That will log every process that starts along with the time it started, the user that started it, and the command line options. You can do the same exact thing on Linux and Mac with Audit D. So if you want to know everything that ran on my Linux server, you have Audit D enabled. As it says at the bottom, this needs to be centralized. The first thing attackers are going to do is clear those log files. So don't expect to have a machine compromised, then go look for the log files on the local disk and expect to really find what the attackers did. Again, you're going to find all the log entries except for those related to the attackers. Versus if they're centralized somewhere, you have a secure server they're being written to, this not only gets around the anti-forensics, it also allows you to query it. And so then we can say it's one query in most interfaces for these logs to say, where did Bob log in? Or this user account ABC123 was created, how many machines was that created on? Because now we know those are compromised and we need to go back and clean them up, versus having to go around the entire network looking at user account information to figure out what's there. Process creation and termination does have a few downsides to it. One is attackers rename executables a lot. We see in particular where they rename executables to one character executable. So you'll have A.exe and B.exe and C.exe. So when you see the fact that those ran, you know that obviously that's malware, it's something suspicious, but you don't exactly know what it is. Another thing we see is where command shell or PowerShell is used, and all you see is command.exe was run or PowerShell was run. It doesn't really tell you what happened. One thing that can help here, and that's very, very useful, especially if you're in a Windows environment, is SCCM. How many people are using SCCM? It's probably not under NDA. Okay, so a lot of people are using that. If you weren't one of the people that raised your hand, you can see the value there. SCCM is crucial in many cases that we do. With SCCM enabled, for every executable that runs, you're going to get the full path of where it ran from. You're going to get the SHA-1 hash of the executable. You're going to get the user it ran as, and so on. The thing we really like is not only does it give us a list of every process that ran along with its path, that SHA-1 hash is very helpful. Because let's say I take Mimikatz and rename it to w.exe. I then run w.exe. I don't really know what that is just from looking at the name, but I can take the SHA-1 hash out of the SCCM records and Google that. VirusTotal is going to find it. It's going to show up on all these download pages. So now I know exactly what that executable is. And that's one of the ways we've been able to track back these weirdly named tools, these renamed tools, back to what they actually were. And obviously, you want as much context as possible when you're working in these real investigations. Another thing we need to be able to do on the endpoints is memory forensics. So I've mentioned this a few times, but your live tools are very susceptible to malware interference. We've done plenty of demos. Other people have videos online as well where you run every live tool possible. You then load the malware and everything disappears from the live system. It's not in the process list. You don't see it in Explorer. So doing live analysis is it basically means you don't want to find the malware. I'm sure it fixes a checkbox somewhere, but you're not actually going to find the infection. So instead, by doing memory forensics, you're not susceptible to that type of interference. Your memory forensics tool is going to look directly in RAM, and it's going to reconstruct the data on its own. It's not going to call live APIs to do it. You can also do memory forensics offline, so completely away from any type of malware interference on your forensics machine. Memory forensics can also scale much better than live analysis or traditional forensics. With memory forensics, you obviously don't have disk images. You don't even need to pull any files from disk. In memory, you'll have the file artifacts that you care about, plus you'll have all the information that's in memory that's not available through APIs. And so if you look at Volatility, which we'll talk about, it's an open source framework for memory forensics used by thousands of investigators. It has over 250 plugins. And so if you look at your live tools, they maybe have 10 columns of output, 20 columns of output they can show you, because that's what Windows or Linux or Mac makes available through the APIs. Versus once you have a memory capture, it's literally anything loaded into RAM. If you can write a script to find it, then you can automatically recover it. So between logging on the endpoints and logging all the data we talked about on the last slide, and between having memory forensics available, we can start to do some actually effective and scalable detection and response. I have some examples here of automating some interesting log analysis. These are things that many companies run. Again, there could be a whole hour talk just on this, but things that I know have caught attacks that were active in environments, things that caught historical breaches at companies. So once we have all that data from our event logs put into a database, if you can answer these 3 questions, or if these would pop out automatically for you, you would catch a lot of attacks that we've seen. So why did Bob, who's in accounting, log into a domain controller? Why did he log into the Exchange server? Why did he log into anything but his desktop? That's something that's very easy to automate in most analysis engines, where users should be. These engines can also learn to some sense. You can say Bob, for the last 3 years that he's been employed, has only logged into these 2 systems. Yesterday he logged into this 3rd system. Why is that? It's probably because the attackers have his credentials now and are moving around. The other thing this kind of catches is those insider threats we used to deal with. Bob used to be a great employee. He now wants to rip off the company, so he's moving around the network to find data he wants to take. Many times your insider threats look exactly like attackers when you're doing forensics. Same with the other ones. Why is a network admin logging in outside of weird time frames? Why do users have privileges they shouldn't? We see that a lot, especially with end users getting compromised. The attackers will get on the machine. That end user, that employee, is not a local admin. They're running with limited privileges. The attackers then escalate privileges, and now you see where these users, who definitely should not be domain admins, suddenly have processes running as domain admins. And this is something that the event logs can track directly for you. When those privilege escalations happen, you then have them logged out somewhere securely, and it shows up right away. And then same idea with memory forensics. We want to replace our live IR artifacts. So we want to replace running those live IR tools by doing memory forensics. By doing that, we're going to get the speed advantage, and we're also not going to be susceptible to anti-forensics. So if you can do this on your endpoints, you have a really good chance of detecting breaches as they happen, when attackers get in your environment, and we can get the detection way earlier. When we move to response, it becomes really straightforward as well. Again, we know that one machine was compromised. That's why we're doing our investigation. We have thousands of machines potentially, though, where the attackers could have moved. How do we pick where to pivot our investigation? Well, we can start with the event logs. We can say the attackers got on this machine at this date at a certain time. All forensics artifacts are timestamped down to the second that they happen. So we can say the malware got on this machine at this second on this day. Well, tell me everything in the event logs that happened within a day of that. We can filter it down to that one machine at first. We can see what systems were accessed from that machine on the network. We can see which user accounts on that machine were then used around the network, and we know where to pivot. We can also use things like our SCCM records to say what was actually run on that system. Do we see netcat? Do we see nmap? Do we see other types of reconnaissance tools? We can get a pretty good idea of what the attackers were doing. That last part, of course, assumes they run executables on the machine. If they have memory-only malware, that's where memory forensics comes in. As soon as we know a machine's compromised or we want to deeply investigate it, the first thing you do is walk up and take a memory capture. And then from there, you're not only going to find malware on disk through memory, you're also going to find that memory-only malware. You'll be able to find a lot of things that your agents can't tell you. So if the attackers were using PowerShell, if they were using command.exe, that's going to be left around in memory. You'll have no record of it anywhere else. And then data that's just hanging out in memory that the APIs don't know about. So again, if the attackers ran some tools, those tools terminated after they ran, that's not going to be available on the live system, where with memory forensics, we can go back and get all of the historical information. So at this point, we can really scale our endpoint-based response. We'll know exactly which machines to look at. We'll have time-stamped activity of everything they did, and we have memory forensics behind us that's going to find the malware no matter how advanced it is. And then we can take that malware out of memory. We can put it in a sandbox. We can reverse engineer it. We can figure out, okay, what registry keys might it write to? If it's memory only, what does that look like in memory? How is it injecting its code? Where is it injecting its code? And then we can build indicators of compromise. And then if you have, again, 10,000 systems in your network, and you have some way to sweep all of those systems looking for these indicators, you can narrow down, say, the 10,000 possible systems to maybe the 3 or 4 that the attackers moved to. Even if the attacker moved to 100 out of 10,000, that's much nicer to know than having to kind of guess at what machines they might go on. And then where this really brings us is not only do we have effective detection and response, we can also do threat hunting. I know threat hunting is a buzzword. The marketing people have picked it up, which means it'll die soon. But it's a really effective technique. People have been doing it a long time before the marketing community figured out what it was. And the idea with threat hunting is you go to your critical machines, you go to the machines that you definitely don't want compromised, your domain controllers, your exchange servers, your source code servers, everything that if it showed up on, say, WikiLeaks or Pastebin, it would be really bad for your company or if a competitor got it. And so with threat hunting, you're going to those critical systems and you're doing proactive analysis. You're pulling the event logs out of your centralized device. You're getting a memory capture. You're doing very deep memory forensics. You're looking at everything possible that you can figure out through memory. You're looking for anomalous event logs. And once you do that, you'll know if the machine is compromised or not. It's not like pen testing or red teaming, which is kind of a guess. Red teaming says, we have these applications, they're vulnerable, attackers might get in this way. Threat hunting says attackers are here or malware's here, here's exactly where it is, now you need to get rid of it. And so if you look at where the real security conscious companies are going, where companies that take security very seriously are going, they're doing this threat hunting all the time. I know several companies that are on quarterly schedules for threat hunting throughout their environment. They bring in third parties. There's companies that have 24/7 threat hunting teams that they've hired. If you're not doing this, especially if you're going to have skilled attackers in your environment, if you're going to have any type of nation-state level threat, you're going to miss something because the automated tools really just can't keep up with how sophisticated the attackers are. If you're not convinced of threat hunting, I have the reference at the end. I did a talk at a different conference that showed you all the information you're going to miss and all the ways you'll get compromised and never find out about it if you're not doing threat hunting. So you can watch that to be convinced. But after that, you're going to follow a very similar flow to what we just talked about. And then the next thing we want to do is have effective detection and response on the network, because the endpoints are obviously a big part of this story, but the endpoints don't have everything. The place that has the truth data, the place that tells you everywhere the attackers went around the network and what they did, that's going to come from the network. If you have NetFlow, my third bullet here, you can see every machine that an internal machine talked to. You can say, okay, it should talk to this machine, it shouldn't talk to this one. Why was it talking to a certain machine? You can then go do forensics on that machine it was talking to. And this is data that you can't reconstruct. Even if you have memory forensics, even if you have disk forensics, if you're trying to look at network connections from weeks ago or months ago, that's not going to be on the endpoint anymore. But if you have your NetFlow log, you can keep that indefinitely. And so it's one of the first things that when we're doing incident response, we want to be able to say, where did this machine talk on the network, where did it make its request to, and then we can start to build a pattern of how those attackers work, and we can start to, again, focus our investigation so that we can scale, because we only want to investigate a machine deeply if we know it was compromised. So NetFlow is one. We can also work at the protocol levels. How many people have heard of passive DNS, at least? A couple. How many people implement it that have heard of it? Only a couple. So passive DNS is by far the cheapest and most effective technology or process you can do for network security and for detection of actual threats. It's cheap because it's a passive sensor, so all you have is a network tap and it's recording data. And it's really effective because what it's doing is you're not getting a full PCAP. Instead, what you're getting are the replies and the requests that go out to a DNS server. So malware has to look up the server that it wants to contact before it can send data. The browser has to look up the domain name of a malicious website before it can talk to it. By doing passive DNS, you're recording all of that flow through your environment. And this is where, from my questions earlier, you get to a place where you can say abc123.com is bad. It's hosting malware. If any machine talked to that website, we know it's compromised. Well, if you have these passive DNS records, you can then ask, you can query that database to say which machines in my environment resolve that domain. And then again, you go from 10,000 machines to the handful that maybe talk to it. Another thing you can do here is build what domains map to over time, especially when you're dealing with dynamic DNS providers. You'll have a domain that has a very short time to live. It's going to change the IP address it points to constantly. It's not enough to just block the IP address that it's currently at when you start your investigation. Versus if you have passive DNS, you'll see every IP address that host resolved to over time, and every IP address that it resolved to inside of your own environment. So at that point, you can block all of those IP addresses. You can search your web proxy logs or your NetFlow for access to all of those IP addresses. And then, again, you have the complete picture of what happened. You don't just have kind of tunnel vision about one infection. You have the complete picture of what happened inside your entire environment. So if you don't have passive DNS, I mean, unless you just haven't heard of it, there's really no excuse not to do it. It's very cheap, very effective. It's one of the things where we can do very, very quick incident response if it's there. And it's really relied on from every incident response person I know. At every company that works as a consultant, I know it's one of the first things when people go work at a company on the IR team. If they don't have passive DNS, they all work to get it implemented because it makes response very, very effective if you have it. Another thing that a lot of places will record, again, we don't want full PCAP, are the HTTP requests and responses. So obviously if you have an SSL connection, so I go to my banking website, that's going to be caught in passive DNS. The domain name of my bank will be recorded, but unfortunately we're not going to break SSL in most cases, so that won't be recorded out. But in the cases where it's not SSL, a lot of malware does not use SSL, a lot of websites don't use SSL yet, if we can record those requests and responses, we can figure out exactly what led to a machine being compromised. So we'll see where a user requests a website, we'll then see a request to a malicious advertisement server. That malicious advertisement server will then download a JavaScript or a Flash file that exploits the machine. None of that chaining together would be possible if we didn't have these logs. But when we have these logs, we can see exactly how that flow goes. We can then, assuming the advertisement server was compromised and it wasn't meant to be malicious, we can try to get that fixed. And then we can also use that to search the web proxy logs to see who else contacted that domain, who else was sent through that flow. Something we see very often is a malicious advertisement server will have 5, 10, or more servers where it's actually hosting the exploit. So if you look at that one response, or the kind of what's on disk on that one user's machine, and you block that one domain, well, you've missed the other 9. And then your next user comes along and gets to the second IP address or the second domain hosting the exploit, and they get compromised as well. Versus when you have these full records, you'll really understand the flow that led to that exploit, and you can block it correctly. Because again, we want to be scalable and we want to be effective. We don't want to fix one infection to 10 minutes later have another one. And so once we have these technologies in places, we have NetFlow, we're recording HTTP requests and replies, we have passive DNS implemented, detection becomes pretty interesting. We can obviously apply threat intelligence to it. We can look for bad domains being resolved. We can look for IP addresses coming back on the resolution of a name. But there's also a lot of analysis we can do ourselves. I have the two most powerful ones here. Once you get passive DNS going, I would want to know every time a newly registered domain is resolved. Because if you're a legitimate company, you don't register your LLC and your website and go public all in the same day. Versus if you're a malware author, you're going to register 100 domains at once because your previous 100 are now blocked. Going to register 100 at once. You're then going to push your malware out to it, and then the employees of the company that you're trying to protect, everyone in the room, they're going to resolve a domain that was registered 5 minutes ago or an hour ago. That just really doesn't happen with legitimate companies. So this is something by having passive DNS that you can query for. You can also look for resolution of dynamic DNS providers. These are basically malware hosting farms, I don't know what else to call them, used very frequently by malware. And so we want to know anytime there's a domain that's resolved off of one of those providers. And this will lead you to a lot of malware. It will lead you to a lot of very fishy behavior. If it's not actually malware itself, you'll see users going to domains they probably shouldn't. You'll see where malicious advertisements are loading on your network. There's a lot you can glean just from these two queries, and obviously there's a lot more you can do as well. On the HTTP side, one thing we run a lot is looking for unusual user agents. So malware will have, they'll try to look like Internet Explorer or Firefox, but they'll have hard-coded user agents. So that's one way we can find them. You'll also see malware that puts like the name of the malware in the user agent, which is a huge red flag that it's not something normal. So those are going to filter directly out as well. And then we also look for file downloads. It's very easy to look for file extensions, to look through the responses to see when certain file types are being downloaded. You'd be surprised how many people will still download a .exe file and then double-click it because some email told them to. And so we can find that very, very quickly by going through the HTTP data. And then I mentioned before with NetFlow, this is going to save us in many cases, especially when the attackers are moving laterally, when they're bouncing between systems. It's just, I'm going to call it impossible in large networks to really have a good idea of everywhere they went if you don't have that network flow that you can track around.
Is there a particular reason, like you list NetFlow, but is that just to assume that you're lumping SFlow in there as well and all the other flow mechanisms?
Yeah, I was just using like a general term. As long as you get the same data back, it really doesn't matter how you get it. So.
I just didn't know if there was a specific reason that you.
No, just use it as like a general term. So once we have those detection capabilities, once we have all that monitoring and logging in place, our response becomes pretty simple. So Bob, again, gets his machine infected. It was infected with malware from abc.xyz. We know we have to investigate Bob's machine. We know we have to look at his account, see where it logged into, and so on. But what about everyone else on the network? How did Bob get there? Was this targeted to our environment? Did Bob send the link to anyone else not knowing what he was doing? How do we figure out where this infection spread? Well, we want to know which other systems resolved the domain. We can do that because we have passive DNS. We want to know the IP addresses that this ever resolved to. So again, passive DNS will answer that for us. We have the HTTP logs to know not only did someone resolve the domain, but did they actually make the request and get the response back from the server. And then, as we saw on the last slide, Bob keeps getting his machine infected, so we want to know where else did Bob talk to? What other internal resources, that's lateral movement by the attackers, and also external resources. Did the attackers get on Bob's machine and start exfiltrating data? So we want to see where those outbound connections went. We can do all of this pretty easily, at least the response might be hard and difficult, but getting the initial data to answer some of these questions is just a query in the database that's storing everything that we've logged. And then when we look at threat hunting on the network, it's pretty straightforward once you have all the data there. You can take those detection stages and do them proactively. You can run queries, you can script out custom queries, you can look at recent data that's gone through the environment. You can do a manual review of historical data. So if you're worried about a particular user or particular servers that you have all of this great network data available to leverage. And then I put some examples here of where statistical analysis becomes really powerful. And so if you say you have 5,000, 10,000 employees, what were the domains that were resolved by less than 100 of those people, less than 50 of those people? If you have the list of IP addresses that they spoke to, why out of your entire environment did one employee talk to this one IP address? And when you start to do those types of analysis, you find things that manually reviewing logs, it would kind of be lost in the noise. You wouldn't have this context about it, and it's something that, again, if your environment or your employee is the first one to get a piece of malware, or your employee is the one that's targeted, there's no threat intel that's going to save you, because the vendors that provide that won't have seen it before. But this type of analysis can really make these oddities and these outliers stand out, and that's where you want to focus your threat hunting. So I'm going to assume you've implemented everything I just talked about on all these slides. So at this point, we can do effective detection and response. We have full visibility on our endpoints and the network. We have all the historical data we want. We have event logs. We have AV logs, other things I didn't talk about that run on the endpoint. We also have plenty of network data that's captured in a historical fashion. And then when a machine's compromised, or we want to do threat hunting and see is there any malware on the machine, we have proper acquisition procedures and analysis processes to do that. We can pull memory from a machine. That's going to defeat the anti-forensics. It's going to tell us not only about malware on disk, but also about malware in memory. And we're certainly going to find even the most advanced attackers that we see out there in the wild. And so the results of this are our threat detection actually finds threats. We're not just running a bunch of sensors and have a bunch of agents installed, not doing much. So by doing this, we're going to find the actual threats in our environment. Once it's detected, it's not where everyone's wondering what to do. We have very actionable data that we can query. We have timeline data, so we can see the events as they happen in order. We have the ability to do deep memory forensics. We can pull that malware out of memory, even if it wasn't written to disk. We can build indicators for it. We can sweep across the network looking for those indicators. And again, the response, it's not instant. It's still not easy. You need some skilled people doing it, but it's possible at this point. And we're not going to do response and containment, and then a couple days later, the malware is back or the attackers are back because we missed something. And that's one of the goals that we want to have. So some of the tools that are commonly used for this, these are all open source tools. You can go download them. For log aggregation, this tool called Graylog is pretty cool. It's not 10 years old or anything. It's kind of new, but it's really nice. You throw all your logs in there. It has a very queryable interface. It understands some of the protocols by default. For memory forensics, there's volatility. As I said, this is used by thousands of investigators around the world. Very, very powerful platform for memory forensics across Windows, Linux, Mac, Android, and so on. For network capture, I'm not going to start like a religious war, but Bro or Suricata will meet your needs. Some people are very particular to the one they like. Check out the one you like and see what works in your environment. And then you also have the elk stack, which if you do any type of forensics or IR and you haven't seen the elk stack, this blog post here is really good. There's all sorts of videos about it online. It's a very powerful way to get all of your data together, filter out and query just what you want, and then have it visualized in a nice way.
Any reason you chose Graylog and not Graylog 2?
No. Okay. No. Yeah. So these are the tools that we normally see for these type of operations. These are the tools we've seen used at scale. It will definitely work in any reasonable network environment that you might need to defend. So that was the end of my slides. I think I have like 9-10 minutes left. Okay. So are there any questions or comments? Yeah, one thing, if you notice in the slides, I had places with like a number in brackets. That was referring to these links. So rather than fill the slides with links, I always just put them at the end. But otherwise, are there any questions or comments?
I got a question, Andrew.
Okay.
So in your engagements, just out of curiosity, question would be, when you go on these engagements as an alternative to passive DNS, how many companies do you find actually logging, like using their DNS server to actually log stuff? I know in my experience, I've always gotten pushback about performance. In the Windows environment, it's pretty flexible even on like what side of the request you actually want to log. But I mean, I agree that passive DNS, that was the route we went ultimately, because put a tap in and admins can shut up. But back
Yes,
to it.
so putting the tap-in's a lot less intrusive. I'm not fully sure of everything Windows will log. I don't know if you can get like the optional records or how deep the logging is. With passive DNS, you can obviously get the entire protocol. The other thing is many networks we go in, unfortunately, they have their internal DNS server, but they don't actually block external DNS, and so you'll miss that if you're on the Microsoft server versus the sensor will just see, hey, this is DNS, I'm gonna log it. So we've definitely seen those issues as well.
Gotcha, thanks.
Any other questions? Oh.
Hi there. So we make use of a solution where we're able to do full memory dumps and so forth from any workstation in our environment. One of the questions I have for you is that if you got an agent that's already set up so you can pull a memory dump right over the network at any given time, do you still feel like there's an actual chance that information that's within the dump itself may actually be filtered out before it makes it to whatever you're using?
It depends how that acquisition tool works. So there's some, it really depends. There's some tools that try to hook certain methods. So there's malware, for instance, like if you hibernate, say a laptop, that's going to notify all the processes that the machine's hibernating, and then malware will scrub itself out of memory. We've seen other malware. We've only seen proof of concept malware try to hook the ranges like where memory is. It's a tool called Dementia. It's like an open source anti-forensics tool. Those tools they're interesting from like a research perspective, but when you use them in the wild, so they'll say like, I hid a process I was running, but in order to hide that process, they had to start a service which loaded a kernel driver, which left all these other artifacts in memory. So they might hide the fact that this one process was there initially, but you're gonna find the anti-forensics tool, and then if you deeply know memory forensics, you're just going to go find whatever they were trying to scrub anyway. There would probably be some artifacts around. So Dementia was the most thorough I've ever seen, whether real cases, open source, whatever. But even it had a loaded driver and everything else, so you could still find it in memory.
Given the amount of cheap and free certificates available out there to threat actors, do you recommend that businesses implement SSL decryption?
It's definitely helpful. You'll hit some scalability issues with how fast they can decrypt and everything, and you can also have applications not use it. Like there's malware that just, like you need their certificate, right? Basically, so you're gonna have to block traffic based on not being able to decrypt it, where most people will just kind of fail through and let the traffic pass through. So it's nice, but in most cases you're gonna end up catching your employees' traffic, which can be valuable versus the malware can kind of work around it anyway, from what I've seen. So.